One of the important aspects of security and risk management is developing and implementing your own security policy in your organization. That's a really protracted discussion. There's a lot of things involved in developing and implementing a security policy, and quite frankly, all the rest of the things that we're going to talk about throughout the rest of the lessons in this domain are actually related to this topic. But we're going to introduce the concept here, and then in further lessons, we're going to kind of do a deep dive into these concepts. What is a policy? Well, a policy is any procedure, standard, guideline, or baseline for implementing your security posture in your environment, right? One is generated from the other, right? So there's a particular set of steps that have to be taken to get to the point where you actually implement this security policy. The whole idea is that a policy is supposed to communicate all the expectations that the security policy requires, executed through a set of procedures and principles of those procedures. Now, it's not supposed to be a technical document, right? It is supposed to be a governing document, and so it's up to the individual stakeholders and the individual groups to further define the specifics to ensure whatever policy enforcement needs to be enforced, or whatever policy enforcement needs to be taken into action. So these policies are typically written on a 6th grade or an 8th grade comprehension level, because they're not supposed to be technical. They're supposed to be a guideline for the organization. The security officer is the prime creator, and I mentioned this before the lunch break. You're not supposed to be the subject matter expert in all of the specific details, but you're supposed to be able to define guidelines, and that's really the whole purpose of an information assurance individual. Even though you're the creator of this document, this policy, which will then spin off into many and many other types of documents, you're the creator. You're not necessarily the initiator of the policy, right? A lot of different individuals can provide input on how this policy should be created. So it is a collaborative effort between department heads and stakeholders and executives and so on to ensure compliance to whatever policy it is that you're trying to implement. Okay? Human resources, of course, would be involved. Your compliance department would be involved. Regulatory organizations and standards bodies might be involved. IT might be involved, business units, and so on. Additional documentation may be required to support policies like additional controls for compliance. That's what I was saying previously when I said this should be written at a 6th or 8th grade level. That doesn't mean your entire policy is written at a 6th or 8th grade level. Certainly any kind of auxiliary documentation that, the tactics, as you will, or if you will, that define how you implement these policies could be very technical. So it's not that it may be required, it's almost always required because the policy itself is more of a directive. Make the policy documents readily available. Make sure you have training associated, checklists that identify whether specific tasks are being met, and always, you always want to ensure awareness of the policy. Whether it's an individual that has to actually read a policy and then accept that policy by checking a box or signing a document, whatever it might be. All right? And as a general rule, though, the policy itself is fairly high level. All right? So what are some of the relationships that affect policy? Well, one of the things that would affect policy is regulation. Okay? Laws, regulation, requirements, organizational goals, objectives. We talked about this. I mean, this is, it depends on your organization. right? And what you're exposed to from a risk perspective and how you're supposed to mitigate that risk can be regulated or kind of derived from a lot of these different categories. What is the law regarding your requirement? What are the regulations? What are the requirements just for business operations and so on? The general organizational policy, that would be the document that we're talking about. This is your security statement. This is what you would draft as an information assurance individual to say, okay, this is our general policy for security. These are the procedures. These are the guidelines that we're using. These are potentially the risks that we're exposed to or the risks that that exist and so on. So that's your 6th to 8th grade level document. And then that is going to spin off all of these functional implementation policies. So this is more of your statement, and these are your technical objectives, right? The implementation policies are the individual security directives that departments and individuals are responsible for implementing, right? Standards, for example. Just about any implementation has at least some set of standards that are followed, right? If you're going to use email, for example, what are the standard use policies for email? If you're going to have a database server, what are some of the standards that I'm going to implement for a database? If I'm going to have a network infrastructure connected to the internet, clearly a standard would be to have some sort of protection from the public side to the private side, okay? Again, these are all sub-functions of this implementing your policies. So define the standards within the silo or within the organization that you have to follow. The procedures would be your step-by-step instructions. You know, close these ports, open these ports, turn on this logging, implement this IPS or IDS function, and so on. Baseline should be your minimum level of security that you're applying to the infrastructure or the procedure or data retention, whatever it might be. All right? That would be your minimum level of security. If no other technical, administrative, or physical controls are implemented, what is our consistent level of security? It's very common. We see this a lot. In fact, I just ran into this recently, right? You go into a building, of course, you have to check in with the receptionist. You're issued a visitor badge, and you're supposed to be escorted, but there's no guideline for defining how that escort is to take place. It's kind of up to the individual to follow the policy or not. And so you might go through this whole process of initiating that security posture by checking somebody in, issuing them a badge that's maybe a different color, or if it could even have the words escort required on it, whatever it might be. But then you don't follow up with the concept that they're actually being escorted. So the baseline would be kind of establishing that policy. The guidelines would be anything beyond whatever the baseline is, right? So these are the recommendations that I would put into place to ensure that we're kind of meeting the general organizational policy requirements that were defined by the management. So guidelines can be, it says recommendations. They can be recommendations, but they can also be, requirements as well. They don't necessarily just have to be recommendations. So it makes sense. This is kind of a hierarchy to these relationships that affect the overall policy. You got your general organizational policy, your functional implementation policies, the standards, the procedures, baselines, guidelines, etc. All right? So what we're going to do over the next few lessons is we're going to do a deep dive into these concepts and really take a look at how we can effectively generate this policy in our organization. That's going to involve several different things, right? It's going to involve identifying risk and applying that risk assessment process to your technology. You're going to have to look at things like business continuity planning, disaster recovery planning, and so on. So very, very important. We're going to get into that right now.